In 2011, a young physics graduate launched what would become the most infamous black market on the internet, Silk Road, a billion-dollar empire built in the shadowy recesses of the dark web, which, for a time, threatened to undermine the very foundations of the economic, social, and political authority of the United States government.
Black tar heroin, you name it, they have it.
In the first episode of the series, we will be introducing some of the main planetary influences in Ross Ulbricht's birth chart and how they speak to his character, life circumstances, and motivations for embarking on the fateful enterprise, which would change his life forever. Finally, it should be noted that since the initial recording of this first installment of the series, major events have taken place which have drastically altered the trajectory of Ross Ulbricht's life. On January 21st, 2025, Ross was granted a full pardon by President Donald Trump, following a campaign promise made at the 2024 Libertarian National Convention, an event with an intriguing and profoundly appropriate astrological context, which will be explored later on in the series. With that, I'm Kyle Pierce, and this is Killer Cosmos. Ross Ulbricht was the founder of a dark web marketplace called the Silk Road, which essentially functioned as a giant black market on the internet, where people could buy and sell drugs, weapons, potentially any number of illegal goods or services with very little risk of being caught by the authorities. The Silk Road operated on the Tor network, which made the tracing of IP addresses virtually impossible and allowed users to maintain anonymity. Transactions were conducted with Bitcoin, but in 2011, when the Silk Road was launched, very few were familiar with even the idea of cryptocurrency. During the 2.5 years that the Silk Road was active, it's estimated that between $200 million and over $1 billion in transactions took place and played a crucial role in introducing the world to the idea of cryptocurrencies, and most specifically Bitcoin. Countless similar marketplaces run on the dark web that were inspired by the Silk Road, quite possibly changing the trajectory of the United States war on drugs forever. As a result, Ross Ulbricht has become something of a icon and sort of martyr for the cryptocurrency community, groups that advocate against the war on drugs, as well as within the Libertarian community, as it was Ross Ulbricht's Libertarian philosophy and political beliefs which inspired and motivated him to create the Silk Road. After Ross was arrested in October of 2013 and the Silk Road was shut down, Ross was ultimately convicted of a slew of charges, including engaging in a continuing criminal enterprise, distributing narcotics, money laundering, and computer hacking, all of which were prosecuted under the federal kingpin statute, which basically means that they can throw the book at you, and they did. They sentenced Ross Ulbricht to 2 life sentences without the possibility of parole and an additional 30 years or so. At the time of his sentencing, Ross was 30 years old. Now, many believe this sentence to be incredibly harsh, given that he was a first-time offender. These were nonviolent crimes, and there are many who advocate that Ross Ulbricht should be freed, or at least granted a reduced sentence. At the time of recording this, Donald Trump, who promised to commute Ross Ulbricht's sentence to time served on day 1 of his presidency if he was elected, has yet to materialize. That could change any day, and it will be one of the many things that we will assess Ross Ulbricht's birth chart for indications of. But without further ado, let's take a look at his birth chart and see how it speaks to who this guy is. Ross was born on March 27th, 1984 at 4:50 a.m. in Austin, Texas. And let's just start with the basics. We have Ross with Pisces Rising, which at a very broad level will describe somebody whose sort of framework for engaging with the world is in some way fundamentally Piscean, right? What's that mean? You could say essentially someone with Pisces Rising is trying to assimilate the totality of lived experience into a broader context. There's an inherent willingness and really a motivation to understand condition and experience and seek to find a sort of harmonious flow. There's a freedom-seeking with Pisces, which aims to allow for the flow of good, what is desirable, what is uplifting. Through the lens of Pisces, we understand reality as a continuum of states that is perpetually changing, and that to hold on to a state or to resist, what can be identified as a natural flow within the grand context is antithetical to what is desirable. This is mutable water, which changes from one state to another and returns back again. And because it's Jupiter-ruled water, it wants to flow, if you will, toward what is good, what is ideal. So, to bring it down to earth, right? It's, Pisces rising people like to be able to move freely. And there's a sensitivity to what might box them in, right? The fish. They swim and they flow with the current. They're seeking to maintain connection with the whole rather than to be pulled out of it or trapped in some alcove within it. Whether the scope of reality is a small fish tank or an entire ocean, we want to understand what that is and exist harmoniously within it. And being Jupiter ruled, we want to move towards the positive. But in order to move towards positive, we have to identify what's negative or what is undesirable and not be there. Or if we are there, we want to understand what it means to be there and connect it to the greater totality of being, right? And that's why people like to call Pisces people dreamy. Many do fall into the category of dreamy, but in a sense, there's always kind of one foot here in present reality and another foot in the unseen, in the abstract space of meaning, which can only be established in context. Now, really, the sign by itself can only tell you so much, and you want to look at what is influencing, the way Ross Ulbricht does Pisces. And one of the first things you might notice is that Venus is in Pisces in his first house. So it's speaking directly to who he is, how he shows up, how he orients himself in the world, and what, motivates him, right? And, typically when we think of drug kingpins, overseers of criminal empires, we don't think of Venus. Venus is a planet that signifies love, beauty, harmony. She represents an influence that wants to connect and get along with the world, right? With people, and wants to partake in what there is to be enjoyed, likes to eat, drink, and be merry. Venus is one of the two benefics, right? And to a large degree, it's the good that is lived on a day-to-day basis or can be found within the material world, which can be money, which can be good food, good conversation, all the things that bring pleasure and joy. And we really like Venus in Pisces, in particular because Venus is said to be exalted in Pisces. This is the sign where we get the highest expression of Venus. So Venus is the planet of love. It's like unconditional love. Beauty, not as a state of perfection, but as a expression of the truth of who somebody is or what something is, which entails acceptance of the totality of it, right? In Pisces, we're not attached to the details. We're looking at the whole of the being, right? So you plop Venus and Pisces in somebody's first house, you're going to tend to get somebody who's very kind, tends to make friends easily, who gets along well with others, probably considered attractive by most conventional standards, but isn't overly attached. It's sort of like roll out of the bed and look beautiful Venus.
How you doing?
Right. One of the things that have been said about Ross Ulbricht time and time again is that he is a generally kind person.
He's also very, very sweet and compassionate and cares about people and very easygoing.
Very friendly, just really a nice guy.
Many described his character as wholesome even. The funny thing, actually, is that he rarely used profanity. Even in his documented conversations with drug dealers and hitmen, he'd say things like golly, geez, heck, right? He has been more or less unanimously described as a really nice guy. And Venus in Pisces in the first house is pretty strong testimony to that. Now, one of the many things that having Venus in the first house will do for you is provide you with sort of baseline luck or good fortune. Because not only is Venus a benefic planet, right, a good doer, positive influence, it's also in a really strong sign for Venus.
Yeah.
One which facilitates her delivering really high quality results in arguably the most potent part of the chart in the first house. So just as a starting point, be looking at somebody who, all of the things aside, is more lucky than most, or at least starts off life in a more favorable position. And Ross did grow up in good upper middle class circumstances. By all accounts, his home and family life was positive.
His dad is an architect and designer, so he designs and builds houses, and he built houses in Costa Rica. And so he was always like, had a really great life.
Not only was he born to privileged circumstances, he also had many personal assets which eased his way through life. He was good looking. He was friendly. He got along well with everyone and everybody liked him. He was also very intelligent. He developed an early interest in mathematics, which isn't always the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Pisces. And I think to a large degree, it can be found elsewhere in the chart. However, Pisces is not a place where we prioritize normal language, right? Oftentimes, the things in Pisces are better expressed through things like poetry or music. However, Pisces' orientation towards the universal, I have found that many people with planets in Pisces develop an appreciation for mathematics as a sort of universal language. But more on that later. You can definitely understand at a baseline that Ross was gifted both personally and circumstantially, which set him up to be capable of doing many things. And by the time he graduated high school, he received a full academic scholarship to the University of Texas, and the world was in many ways his oyster, right?
Oh my God, that is funny!
Now, one of the other things about Ross, even as he was getting perfect grades, getting scholarships, and getting degrees, he also had a great appreciation for mind-altering substances. Often with Pisces stuff, there's an interest in the altered state of consciousness, right? And drugs can be a natural or unnatural pathway to achieving that. Many friends have reported that he very much enjoyed taking mushrooms, wandering around in nature, and taking his clothes off. It's Pisces, right? It's moving into a state of appreciation of nature without the encumbrance or limitations of clothing. I also very much like to, smoke weed and that sort of thing. But by all accounts, there's no indication that he had like a substance abuse problem, which we might expect with Venus in Pisces, being able to, appreciate what there is to appreciate, right? But without getting attached to it in an unhealthy way, at least in terms of maybe addiction. He also seemed to avoid hard drugs himself and mostly just enjoyed doing sort of hippie stuff and going to drum circles and surfing, hanging out and just vibing, right? And if that was the whole story, he wouldn't be the subject of a Killer Cosmos episode. But as we can see, that's not the whole story in the chart. And I think we need to start with the extremely close trine that Venus is in with Saturn in Scorpio in the 9th house. Now, typically, we don't think of a trine as being a problematic aspect. Planets that are trying to agree with each other and support each other in their endeavors. And one of the things that we'll want to consider with Saturn is that because Ross was born at night, Saturn is the out-of-sect malefic, which means that Saturn is a less constructive kind of problem. Obviously, we can't and won't say that everything that Saturn signifies is terrible and awful. However, part of what that means is that Saturn is just a little more extreme, and more extreme in a way that pulls the life in a direction that is not especially helpful, or that pulls the life out of moderation, outside of the middle. So what might Saturn be describing? Well, Saturn is in the 9th house, right? So it has something to say about how Ross sees the world, what his beliefs about the world are. And, well, so what is Saturn? Saturn is characteristically critical. It's negating. It doesn't usually have a lot of positive things to say. It's looking at problems, and especially in a night chart, it's pointing to problems that are more deeply entrenched, right? So what kind of problems did Ross Ulbricht see in the world that were deeply entrenched and maybe had something to do with structure, right? Saturn builds walls, creates hierarchies and bureaucracies and complexes, which control and sometimes stifle or negate the flow of things or the movement of things.
This went beyond just, like legalizing marijuana or even heroin. He wanted to see a new relationship between individuals and the government, where the government was, basically hamstrung and couldn't control what people bought and sold.
In Scorpio, we're dealing with the flow of more complex water, right? perhaps the flow of desires, the underground flow of things that are deeply wanted, that must be had, or feel like they must be. And sometimes they shouldn't be. On one level, Saturn is representing perhaps the government's oppressive laws against, we'll say, drugs. Not everything about Scorpio is drugs, but illicit drugs are some of the many things that can show up in Scorpio. We get underground or below the surface activity. So maybe Saturn represents a government trying to put limits, impose limits on the things that flow in the underground, right? And in a night chart, we don't tend to like Saturn as much. And we experience Saturn as being too oppressive, too harsh, unfair. And while Saturn represents the structure itself, it also represents the experience of the structure, the being critical of it. And it was while he was in college, in his 9th house, he developed his libertarian views, which part of that framework is the understanding that, the government is oppressive and creating obstacles which hinder expansion and growth. Free market, right? Venus likes places of exchange. Venus and Pisces would like a free-flowing market, right? So Venus looks at Saturn and says, yeah, dude, that's bullshit. I hate how the government's always creating regulations, which make it hard to start businesses and make money, which is a big part of Ross's story. You see, while he was in school and adopted these libertarian political beliefs, he developed an ambition to become an entrepreneur.
Where there are a lot of people that would never start their own business, but Ross, sure, why not?
We do get Jupiter in the 11th house ruling the first, which has a big role to play in describing who Ross is, as well as his life trajectory. And one of the many things that we like to do in the 11th house is start profitable ventures. It's a profitable house. Jupiter's also in Capricorn, which is an orientation towards the physical, the necessities of life, making money, doing the practical thing in the world, and building. In Capricorn, we're shaping the hard, cold earth into mountains, into pyramids, into castles, right? We're trying to understand what the laws are. How is money made? What do people want to buy? What do people need? What are the cold, hard facts of how shit gets done? So because Jupiter is in Capricorn, it's receiving significations from Saturn. Saturn is in charge of Capricorn, so it's describing what's happening there, or giving the subject of the topic of what Ross is doing in the 11th house, in describing the context, or maybe describing the environment or what is being responded to. And we'll get to that more, but let's focus a little bit more on Saturn first. We have to look at the fact that Saturn is with Mars in Scorpio. While Scorpio is not really a Saturn-friendly sign, Saturn doesn't have official business there. It doesn't rule the sign, exalted. It doesn't have any other forms of rulership except for the last part. Saturn's bound in Scorpio, which Mars happens to be in, which is interesting. But Mars does. Mars rules Scorpio. So Mars knows how to get what it wants in Scorpio. And maybe a little more literally describes what might be a war in that space. It's Mars and Saturn together in Ross's 9th house, with Pluto no less. Ross's experience looking up at the 9th house, looking up at the world, and seeing kind of a fucked up place, right? Or stuff that he doesn't like. He sees perhaps a war on drugs, right? Mars is the conflict, right? But what do we do when there's a war? We fight back, right? It's perhaps speaking to a willingness to fight on behalf of his beliefs, or in resistance to the Saturn that's hanging out in that space that, from Mars's perspective, doesn't belong there. But also worth noting, when we're looking at what Mars is doing here, is that on the day he was born, March 27th, Mars is direct. It looks like it's going forward. However, it's moving rather slow. In fact, it's moving so slow, it's almost not moving at all. And about a week or so after he was born, Mars stationed and began moving backwards. So this Mars is kind of like, wait a minute, I don't think I like what's going on. Maybe I need to go back and do something, right? I have unfinished business and previous degrees. I got to backtrack. That slowing down is a sort of point of increasing ambivalence before Mars goes back and decides to change direction, literally move against what's established, and eventually move back, take on Saturn perhaps. Adds a bit of emphasis to what Mars is doing. And certainly while he did complete his first degree in physics. It was after getting his physics degree that he started reconsidering his life path and seeing his role in the world as one that must involve resisting this oppressive system that he saw and live in accordance with his libertarian political philosophy, which, when we see that Mars rules his second house, adds an extra layer of speaking specifically to economic topics. And it was during that period of his life that libertarian economic theory became a real big part of how he viewed himself as an agent in the world. And it was a very huge part of why he created the Silk Road, which, how many ways does Ross's chart describe the Silk Road? Let me count the ways. It's truly spelled out, 10 ways till Sunday. That's even a term. But often when I think about Scorpio, I like to think about Mordor from the Lord of the Rings series, if you're familiar. Mordor was a place where all the orcs lived, and, it was scary and dangerous. And if you wanted to travel through Mordor or just operate there, you wanted ranger skills, right? You wanted Viggo Mortensen escorting you through Mordor, protecting you. And that's essentially Mars, right? Mars ushers you through the danger, fights if a fight needs to happen, but avoids unnecessary fights, right? It moves around the danger or underneath it and perhaps undermines it, or, sneaks up from behind and cuts its throat. It's able to move through Mordor, but also, if it needs something there, it can get something there. It wants some drugs. Mars can get in there and get out, can get its needs met. Mars, as the sect malefic for Ross, so the malefic that is more constructive, that tends to serve the interests of the individual's life more, or at least we experience it that way. For Ross, that's Mars. So Mars likes the idea of fighting back against this monstrosity as he sees it. That is not only limiting the free flow of people just doing what their will is, having their desires fulfilled, but also making it more dangerous by pushing it underground. By making it illegal, it actually creates a place outside of the law that is inherently more chaotic, more dangerous, more toxic, if you will. This is what this all speaks to. So with Saturn and that whole story in the 9th house sort of guiding Jupiter's actions in the 11th, right? Jupiter, or Ross will say, was very interested in becoming an entrepreneur, as is considered a desirable and respectable activity or role in life to play, according to libertarian philosophy, to be a free economic agent. And that is what Ross did for the first half of his 20s, was try to start businesses. And he started a bunch of them. Now, probably a good opportunity to consider what the general condition of Jupiter is in Ross's 11th house, ruling his ascendant, telling a big part of his story. And that one of the main things we're considering is that Jupiter is considered to be in the sign of its fall in Capricorn. And it's in the sign of their fall, tend to get the wrong idea about things or tend to get stuck. It doesn't tend to go the way the planet wants. Not that it never does or can't. It's just the sign is sort of built to confuse the planet. And Jupiter is a planet of expansion and growth and hope and inspiring people, uplifting people. And essentially, Jupiter ends up bringing its idealism, its optimism, and, for lack of a better word, privilege, as Jupiter speaks to those who are blessed with the internal and material circumstantial resources to be able to have things like ideals, to dream of something more than what is. Jupiter brings that to Capricorn, a place where things don't get done that way. They don't get done by inspiration and idealism and good luck. They get done by hard work. The existing structures and practical and sometimes harsh considerations that are just the facts. Operating in Capricorn requires a respect for the structures in place. And only when you humble yourself before those structures can you carefully begin to climb them and maybe build on top of them or reform them from within. Can't inspire people in the moving mountains. You might be able to inspire them to work hard enough to, carefully dig shovel by shovel every bit of dirt in the mountain and relocate it painstakingly over an agonizing amount of time. But that's Mars-Saturn stuff. That's not what Jupiter does or how Jupiter operates. And we can see this with Ross Ulbricht. He, in a sense, entered a world sort of unknowingly, well, idealistically, and sort of just open the floodgates without perhaps full consideration or, and here's the kicker, proper respect for the powers and structures that be. Capricorn's not a place where you judge whether the mountain is right or wrong to be there. It just is there. Ross Ulbricht started the Silk Road with the intention of quite literally undermining the power and authority of the U.S. government. His stated mission was to completely bypass the United States drug laws, create a marketplace that the government couldn't touch, and basically make it so impossible for the United States to prosecute the war on drugs and enforce limitations on, what people can put in their bodies, that they would just have to surrender and give up. Say, well, since we can't stop you, I guess we'll just have to let you do your thing, right? And the thing about governments, right, especially very powerful ones, they really don't like it when you try to undermine their authority and not only break the law, but try to make them look stupid, right? Governments don't like to look weak. And for practical reasons, right? If the authority of the government gets questioned long enough, its legitimacy weakens. It loses its hold on the society. And at least certain iterations of the libertarian agenda see that as paving the way to a golden age of liberty. When you eliminate a source of authority, a vacuum exists and then something else comes and takes its place. It's a very dangerous thing to challenge the authority of the most powerful government in the world. And quite literally, that's what was being described in Ross's birth chart with Jupiter in its fall in Capricorn, with Neptune, no less, which adds a certain level of ungroundedness or unrealistic expectation, maybe motivating things. And I imagine Ross would agree that he got in over his head. His heart entrepreneurial endeavor, heart political revolution that he began blew up quite a bit bigger than he was prepared to deal with. His ideals and good intentions weren't enough to either defeat or evade the United States government. And to a large degree, we're able to see his current situation, at least at the time of recording this, by looking at the condition of the moon. In a night chart especially, tends to pull a person's life in its direction because that's where the light is. We tend to move towards it. And Ross had the moon in Aquarius in the 12th house. 12th house is traditionally described very literally as a place of incarceration, place of imprisonment, loss of agency. It's not always that literal, but it does describe parts of our life or our subconscious that tend to elude our grasp. We don't experience a default large amount of agency in the 12th house. And while most people's 12th houses don't lead them into prison, we can see that for Ross, this was the case, especially when we see the moon applying to a square with Saturn. Square is a harsh aspect, and Saturn in many ways represents those laws and structures which are hard. And if you defy them without due consideration or respect, they will smack you back down. And Saturn can signify imprisonment or confinement. So the moon's receiving square from a planet that can signify law and prison and confinement in a sign that's ruled by the Saturn that represents all these laws that Ross made it his mission to undermine and liberate people from, which in Aquarius, that's largely what we're trying to do, is we're trying to build a world outside of the walls. We're seeing what is, saying, well, that sucks, fuck that, let's make something new. But unfortunately, we can see that that freedom-seeking moon in Aquarius is overcome or dominated by Saturn. Saturn is in the superior square that makes Saturn a kind of boss. The moon doesn't win in this case. However, there is quite a bit more to the story and more to this chart. And if you stick around for part 2 of this series, we will take a look at the influence of the Sun and Mercury and Aries, and we'll explore more thoroughly the specific conditions and planets in his chart, end up describing what is a much more nuanced story and outcome than just a well-meaning but misguided idealistic kid accidentally starts a drug empire and ends up in prison. And some of these details might suggest that this story is far from over. So tune in next time and thanks for watching.